Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or famously known as Lenin, was born in 1870 in the town of Simbirsk, on the banks of the Volga River in the Russian Empire. His family lived a comfortable life. They were not rich, but they were respected. His father, Ilya Ulyanov, was a school inspector, a government man who believed in education and improvement. His mother, Maria Alexandrovna, was smart, quiet, and strict, with noble blood and a deep love of reading. The Ulyanovs were seen as loyal servants of the Tsar, the kind of family that followed the rules and believed in the system. That belief wouldn't survive for long. Vladimir wasn't the star of the family in his early years. That title belonged to his older brother, Alexander Ulyanov. Everyone loved Sasha. Brilliant, serious, respectful. He studied science in St. Petersburg and was on track to become a famous academic. But as Russia cracked under poverty, injustice, and repression, Alexander began to change. He joined a secret group of students who believed the Tsar had to die for the country to change. They weren't joking. In 1887, Alexander and his friends made bombs. They planned to throw one at Tsar Alexander III during a public event. But the police found out before they could act. Alexander was arrested, put on trial, and quickly sentenced to death. The court didn't listen to pleas for mercy. They didn't even let the family say goodbye. He was hanged on May 8, 1887. He was only 21. The shock hit Ulyanovs like a thunderbolt. Their respected name meant nothing now. The government that once gave them a medal took away their pension. Friends stopped visiting. Neighbors turned cold. Lenin's older sister, Anna, was arrested too, simply for having letters from Alexander. She was sent away into internal exile. Once proud, peaceful, and loyal, the family was now marked as dangerous. But Vladimir's reaction was strange. He didn't cry in public. He didn't shout or protest. He never spoke about Alexander again. Not in speeches, not in writing, not even in private letters. It was as if his brother had vanished from memory. And yet, deep in his room, Vladimir kept something hidden, a piece of the rope used to hang Alexander. Some say it was guilt, some say it was grief, others say it was a reminder. But everyone agrees on one thing. From that year on, Vladimir Ulyanov changed completely. He stopped playing games. He stopped talking about becoming a teacher or lawyer. Instead, he started reading, obsessively. He read Karl Marx, Russian revolutionaries, books on class struggle, economic systems, and political history. He didn't want revenge with bombs. He wanted a strategy. His brother had tried to kill the Tsar with one act. It had failed. Now Vladimir was planning something bigger, a revolution that would never be forgotten. In school, he started arguing with teachers. At home, he stopped going to church. He said the system was fake. The law was a tool for the rich, and justice, that was for the fools who still believed in it. He wasn't interested in protests or slogans. He wanted real power, the kind that doesn't beg for change but demands it. Still, he kept his head down. He didn't shout in the streets or wave red flags. Not yet. He waited. He studied. He grew quiet and cold, a boy with a secret fire inside. Some say Alexander's death made Lenin hate the Tsar. That's true. But it also made him hate weakness. Alexander had died trying to make a change with hope and ideals. Vladimir learned a different lesson. Hope doesn't win. Control does. By the end of 1887, Vladimir was no longer just a teenager from a broken family. He was something new, not a radical, not yet a leader, but a young man who had seen the truth. The system kills, and the only way to survive is to destroy it first. This is where Lenin begins, not with ideas, not with speeches, but with a noose, a lie, and a dead brother. The next steps? They'll be taken with purpose. Between 1888 and 1893, he read everything he could find about revolution, capitalism, and the state. He didn't just read Marx, he absorbed him. He called Marxism a scientific truth, not a dream. It wasn't a wish for a better world. It was a manual on how to crush the old one. At Kazan University, Vladimir enrolled to study law, but he didn't last long. That same year, 1887, he joined a student protest against university rules. He didn't throw anything. He didn't even speak, but he was arrested and expelled. Just like that, his formal education ended. But instead of being crushed, he saw this as a sign. Education from the state was useless. He would teach himself, and he would become the kind of leader who never needed permission again. He returned to Simbirsk, studied privately, and earned a law degree in 1891, not by attending classes, but by passing exams as an external student. He started working as a lawyer, defending poor peasants and workers. But the courtroom was a cage. He didn't want to fix the laws. He wanted to replace them. In the early 1890s, he moved to Samara, then to St. Petersburg, where he became active in underground Marxist circles. These weren't big movements, just small groups meeting in secret apartments, whispering over tea, and printing leaflets on illegal presses. But Vladimir stood out. He was organized, focused, and fearless. In 1895, he co-founded the Union of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class. It was small, but it was bold, the beginning of something far bigger. That same year, he was arrested for his political work and sentenced to 3 years of exile in Siberia. This was normal punishment for revolutionaries. The Tsarist state didn't like to execute unless it had to. Exile was cheaper. But for Vladimir, exile didn't break him. It became a workshop for the next phase of his life. He was sent to a small village called Shushenskoye, isolated and cold. The winters were brutal. The work was dull, but Vladimir kept writing. Essays, letters, drafts of future books. He studied the local economy. He took long walks and talked with villagers. He observed how people lived, what they feared, and how they thought. He wasn't just planning a revolution. He was studying how to control people when it came. While in Shushenskoye, he also met and married Nadezhda Krupskaya. She wasn't rich. She was serious, educated, and just as committed to Marxism as he was. Their relationship was built on politics first, emotions second. They read together, organized together, and discussed theory more than romance. Their marriage was approved only because they pretended it was a way for her to join him in exile. Even love, in Lenin's world, had to serve the revolution. It was during this period that Vladimir Ulyanov first began using the name Lenin. Historians still debate why. Some say it was taken from the Lena River in Siberia. Others think it was chosen simply because it sounded Russian but wasn't tied to his family. Whatever the case, he hated it. He once called the name a boring disguise, but it stuck. From then on, the world would know him not as Ulyanov, but as Lenin, a name he didn't love, but one that would become feared across continents. But he kept one thing in mind, his brother's mistake. Alexander had joined a movement that used one act of violence to try and change the world. Lenin now believed the real revolution would need more than courage. It would need structure, planning, secrecy, and power that never apologized. By the year 1900, Lenin was no longer just a grieving younger brother. He was a lawyer, an exile, a leader in training, and the mind behind a future that no one, not even the Tsar, could imagine. The boy was gone. The builder of revolutions had arrived. Lenin realized something important. Most Russian revolutionaries were scattered, confused, and working alone. Some were focused only on peasant uprisings. Others were reading Marx but had no plan. There were dozens of small groups across Russia and Europe, all talking about change, but nobody was coordinating them. Lenin saw the danger. Without unity, the Tsar's police would pick them off one by one. Without discipline, the revolution would fail before it even began. He decided to fix it with a newspaper. In 1900, while living in exile in Germany and Switzerland, Lenin helped launch Iskra, a small illegal newspaper whose name meant the spark. The full phrase came from an old Russian saying, "From a spark, a flame will burst." And that's exactly what Lenin wanted, a spark that would light a fire across the empire. But Iskra wasn't just about news. It wasn't a newspaper like people think today. It was a weapon, a test run for Lenin's real plan, creating one powerful, professional revolutionary party. It was written in exile, mostly in Munich, later London and Geneva, to stay out of the Tsar's reach. It was smuggled into Russia secretly, hidden inside books, shoes, coat linings, even loaves of bread. It attacked Lenin's rivals, criticizing other socialist groups for being weak, soft, or confused. It hammered the idea of a tight, disciplined organization. No random protests, no spontaneous actions, only coordinated strikes under one leadership. Every issue included theory, strategy, and real action plans. How to organize cells, how to resist police, how to stay loyal to the cause. It created a sense that there was already a real living party, even though at first it was just a dream on paper. Lenin wasn't just informing people, he was training them. Each article was like a lesson. How to think, how to organize, how to obey orders, how to recognize enemies, not just in the government, but inside the revolution itself. Iskra became the heartbeat of Russian Marxism. It connected revolutionaries across thousands of miles. A worker in St. Petersburg could read the same words as an intellectual in Kiev, and both would feel they were part of one movement, Lenin's movement. But there was a deeper side too. Through Iskra, Lenin began setting traps, subtle ones. He used it to identify who agreed with him and who didn't. If you followed the ideas in Iskra, you were part of the future. If you hesitated, argued, or disagreed, Lenin marked you as a danger, someone who would eventually have to be pushed out or crushed. Even inside exile circles, tensions rose. Other leaders like Julius Martov, Vera Zasulich, and Georgy Plekhanov helped write early editions. But Lenin's style, sharp, unforgiving, controlling, started to dominate. Many comrades thought Iskra would be a tool for debate among socialists. Lenin saw it as a tool for command. This difference, small at first, would explode just a few years later into the famous Bolshevik-Menshevik split. But back then, in 1900 to 1903, Iskra looked like a miracle. Inside the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, RSDLP, which all Marxists belonged to at the time, two main ideas were floating around. One group wanted a large party open to many different types of workers, students, and thinkers. They believed in wide participation and debate. Lenin didn't. He believed in a small, tight, professional group. People trained, trusted, and loyal to the cause. No room for debate, no room for delays. This disagreement came to a head in 1903 at the Second Congress of the RSDLP, held first in Brussels, then moved to London after Belgian police interference. Delegates from across Europe gathered to define what the party should be. The argument seemed small at first. It started with one rule. Who should be considered a member of the party? Julius Martov, Lenin's old ally, said anyone who supported the party could be a member. Lenin disagreed. He said only those who actively worked for it should count. But this wasn't about membership. It was about control. When the vote came, Martov won. Most delegates agreed with him. Lenin's definition was lost. But then Lenin did something shocking. He walked out. Not in anger, not in defeat, in strategy. When some delegates left later due to unrelated arguments, Lenin returned with a smaller group of loyalists and declared his faction the majority, the Bolsheviks. Martov's faction, even though it had more support originally, was labeled the Mensheviks, or minority. It was a propaganda move. The names stuck. Bolsheviks, majority. Mensheviks, minority. Even though it was technically a lie, Lenin understood that perception matters more than numbers. This split was the beginning of something dangerous, not just for the Russian Revolution, but for revolutions everywhere. From this point on, Lenin showed he would rather break a movement in half than share leadership. He believed in clarity over unity, obedience over inclusion, and victory over kindness. They were workers, men, women, and children, carrying icons of the Tsar, singing hymns, and holding signs asking for better wages, shorter hours, and an end to corruption. They weren't there to riot. They were there to beg. Leading them was Father Georgy Gapon, an Orthodox priest who believed the Tsar still cared for his people. He was wrong. As the march approached the palace gates, soldiers opened fire, without warning, without mercy. More than 1,000 people were killed. Some were shot in the back as they ran. Mothers fell over their children. The snow turned red. This day became known as Bloody Sunday, and it changed everything. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Africa's geopolitics, economy, and changing landscape. Let's continue now. Back in Switzerland, Lenin read the news with cold excitement. This wasn't sorrow. This was opportunity. The people had finally lost faith in the Tsar. Strikes broke out across the empire. Peasants burned mansions, soldiers mutinied. The system was breaking. But there was a problem. Lenin wasn't in Russia. He was thousands of kilometers away in Geneva, watching the fire spread but unable to direct it. His Bolshevik organization was still small, still underground. And while Lenin was writing leaflets and letters, someone else was taking center stage. That someone was Leon Trotsky. Trotsky was younger, flashier, and far more charismatic than Lenin. A Menshevik at the time, Trotsky returned to Russia immediately after the violence began. While Lenin hesitated, Trotsky stepped into the storm. In St. Petersburg, workers formed a powerful new organization, the Soviet, or Council, to coordinate protests, strikes, and self-defense. This was not a government, but it acted like one. And soon, Trotsky became its leader. He gave speeches to thousands. He printed newspapers. He organized strikes that froze entire cities. The Soviet Union wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a real political force with Trotsky at the helm. Lenin saw it all from afar, and he saw something he hadn't expected. The Soviet system worked. It was fast, direct, and deeply connected to the people. He hadn't created it, but now he wanted to own it. Meanwhile, the Tsar, Nicholas II, panicked. He issued the October Manifesto, promising a constitution, civil rights, and a parliament, the Duma. It was a fake compromise, designed to calm the protests while the regime regrouped. Some revolutionaries celebrated. Others were cautious. Lenin? He saw a trap. In a private letter, he called the manifesto a lie to break our momentum. He was right. Within weeks, the government struck back. Cossacks attacked the protesters. The Soviet in St. Petersburg was raided. Trotsky and the other leaders were arrested. The revolution of 1905 was over. But it left scars and lessons. Lenin finally returned to Russia in late 1905. But it was too late. The energy was fading. The strikes were ending. The Soviets were being crushed. He gave speeches, met workers, and tried to rebuild. But the window had closed. He watched as Trotsky, even in prison, became a hero to the workers. His trial was public. His speeches were printed. His popularity grew. Lenin didn't like it. For years, he had told everyone that only his model, a strict, controlled party, could lead a revolution. But in 1905, a loosely organized Soviet did what he couldn't, and a rival led it. Still, Lenin didn't give up. He went back into exile, deeper than before. And he began studying the 1905 revolution like a scientist studies a failed experiment. He saw three things clearly. The people were ready, but they needed to be guided. The Soviets were powerful, but too open and disorganized. Next time, he had to be in the center of it, with no Trotsky, no Mensheviks, and no surprises. The 1905 revolution was not a victory. But for Lenin, it was something almost as valuable. A test run, a dress rehearsal. The audience hadn't cheered, but he now knew how to change the script for the real performance. In 1914, when World War I broke out, most socialist leaders around the world made a surprising choice. They supported it. They said it was about defending their countries, protecting workers from foreign powers, and fighting for national pride. Lenin thought they were fools. To him, the war was a distraction, a way for empires to trick workers into killing each other so that kings and bankers could stay in power. He believed the war should be used, not supported. His slogan was short and sharp: turn the imperialist war into a civil war. But nobody listened. Lenin found himself isolated, politically and physically. He spent most of these war years in Zurich, Switzerland, cut off from Russia, running out of money, arguing with other exiled Marxists in small apartments and cafes. His beard had turned gray. His hands shook when he wrote. He was in his mid-40s, broke and losing relevance. Still, he wrote every day. He believed war would destroy the Tsar faster than any pamphlet ever could. He just had to wait. And then, in February 1917, it happened. Back in Russia, after years of war, famine, and hopelessness, the people finally snapped. The army refused to shoot the protesters. The Duma took control. And just like that, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. The 300-year-old Romanov monarchy was over. A new government was formed. The Provisional Government, led by liberals and moderates. It promised peace, land, and democracy. But Lenin didn't trust it for a second. From Zurich, he watched carefully. The Tsar was gone, but the war continued. The peasants had no land, and the same officials still sat in power. To Lenin, it wasn't a revolution. It was just a reshuffle, and it needed to be shattered before it hardened. But there was a problem. He was stuck in Switzerland. And then came the twist that would shock history. In Berlin, German military leaders were watching Russia fall apart, and they had an idea. Russia and Germany were still enemies in the war. But if they could help make Russia collapse completely, it would save Germany from fighting on two fronts. So they made a decision. Let's send Lenin back to Russia. Let him cause chaos. Let him bring down the new government. It was a strange plan, like sending a virus to your enemy. But they agreed it was worth the risk. In April 1917, the Germans gave Lenin and a small group of revolutionaries a sealed train car, loaded with supplies, food, and money. 50 million gold marks. They couldn't leave the train. They weren't allowed to talk to Germans. It was a moving prison. But Lenin didn't care. He had his ticket home. Inside the train, Lenin acted like a general on the move. He read newspapers, gave lectures to his team, and refused to speak to anyone who wasn't a Bolshevik. To him, even now, unity was weakness. Every moment he sharpened his plans. The journey took over a week, crossing Germany, Sweden, and Finland. At each stop, guards stood outside the train with weapons, not to protect the passengers, but to make sure they didn't escape. Finally, on April 16, 1917, the train pulled into Finland station in Petrograd. Thousands were waiting. Some were confused, some were angry, but many were cheering. Lenin stepped off the train, climbed onto a car, and gave a short, sharp speech. Peace, land, bread, all power to the Soviets. Simple, dangerous, director. He didn't greet the provisional government. He didn't thank anyone. He walked right past the officials and declared that Russia was still under the control of the rich, and that he was back to finish what had been started. Many people thought he was crazy. Even his fellow socialists didn't agree with him. They said the revolution was already done. Now it was time for rebuilding. But Lenin saw it differently. To him, this was just the first fall. Now he would bring the final collapse. In secret meetings, he outlined what became known as the April Theses, 10 points that demanded an immediate end to the war. All land was given to peasants. All power was handed to the Soviets. The destruction of the provisional government. The uprising was spontaneous. It came from the people, not from the top of the party. Some Bolsheviks thought they should join the protests. Others, including Lenin himself, were unsure. The crowds wanted action, not speeches. But the provisional government still controlled the army, the police, and the media. Lenin hesitated. Still, when the protests reached their peak around July 3rd to 5th, the Bolsheviks jumped in. Lenin gave speeches. Posters appeared calling for the government to resign. Soldiers from the powerful Kronstadt naval base joined the uprising. Weapons were handed out. It looked like a revolution. But Lenin made a fatal mistake. He didn't try to take power. He thought the people weren't fully ready. The army might still defend the government. His party wasn't united, so he pulled back, even as thousands were still in the streets waiting for orders. Kerensky moved fast. The provisional government declared the uprising a German-funded plot. They printed documents, real ones, showing that Lenin had received money from the German Empire. These weren't rumors anymore. These were bank records, reports, and testimonies from captured agents. The public was shocked. Even some Bolsheviks felt betrayed. Was Lenin a patriot or a traitor? Suddenly, Lenin went from revolutionary hero to wanted criminal. A warrant was issued for his arrest. Police raided Bolshevik headquarters. The newspapers turned against him. Former allies disappeared. It was 1905 all over again. Only this time, the stakes were higher. To stay alive, Lenin went underground. He shaved his beard, put on old worker clothes, and vanished from Petrograd. With help from loyal comrades, he escaped north to Finland, disguised as a railway worker named Konstantin Petrovich. He wore a wig, grew a mustache, and crossed forests by night. Some say he carried a revolver. Others say he barely spoke during the journey. In hiding, he moved between barns, cottages, and safe houses, writing notes, planning next steps, and watching the government closely. He didn't know if he'd ever return to Petrograd. Meanwhile, back in the city, the Bolsheviks were in trouble. Their newspaper was shut down. Leaders like Trotsky were arrested. Kerensky declared martial law. The streets were quiet again, and Lenin was being blamed for everything. It looked like the Bolsheviks were finished, but Lenin wasn't broken. In Finland, he spent his days writing one of his most important works, The State and Revolution. In it, he laid out his real vision. No more pretending. He called for the destruction of the capitalist state, the abolition of the police and army, and power in the hands of the Soviets only. He praised violence. He praised dictatorship. He made it clear, this wouldn't be a peaceful transition. This would be a full-scale political war. The July days had failed, but Lenin had learned something crucial. You can't just wait for the right moment. You have to create it. Next time, there would be no hesitation. And that next time, it would come in October 1917, just 3 months away. The provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, had lost the people's trust. Nobody was in control. In Petrograd, Bolshevik support had exploded. The Soviets, the councils of workers and soldiers, were slowly being taken over by Lenin's allies. Lenin was still hiding in Finland, but his ideas were spreading like fire. Every day, more people began chanting the same demand: all power to the Soviets. In early October, Trotsky was released from prison. He immediately rejoined the movement and began organizing the Petrograd Soviet like a military force. He wasn't just printing leaflets anymore. He was giving orders to soldiers, workers, and armed Red Guards. By the middle of the month, Lenin returned secretly to Petrograd, wearing another disguise. He met in basements, moved at night, and pushed one idea: we must take power, now. The plan was simple. Trotsky created the Military Revolutionary Committee, a Bolshevik-controlled force operating inside the Soviet, not under the provisional government. It gave him access to weapons, soldiers, and communications, legally, at least on paper. Lenin and Trotsky chose October 25th by the old Russian calendar, November 7th today as the day to act. The target, the Winter Palace, where the provisional government was based. But here's the part they never put in the movies. There was no dramatic battle, no mass uprising, no storming of gates with thousands of people shouting. The palace was barely defended. Most of the army had switched sides or refused to fight. The guards were tired, confused, and leaderless. There were more journalists in the building than actual defenders. Late that night, the Bolsheviks quietly entered through side doors and back halls. There were a few warning shots, but no real combat. One of the palace rooms was even being used for a government dinner while the takeover was happening. By early morning, it was done. The ministers were arrested. Kerensky had already fled the city in a stolen car. Lenin appeared at the Soviet Congress that same night and announced, "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order. No vote, no election, just power taken in silence." A few days later, Soviet filmmakers and newspapers began rewriting the story. They showed brave workers charging the palace, flags waving, bullets flying. Giant posters and films claimed this was a heroic people's victory, full of sacrifice and glory. In truth, it was a coup. A quiet, calculated seizure of the capital by a small, organized group that knew exactly where to strike. It worked, and most people didn't even realize what had happened until it was over. Lenin wasted no time in transforming Russia. His first major act was to pull Russia out of World War I, a war that had bled the country dry. Just a few months after the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in March 1918. It was a harsh treaty, and Russia lost massive amounts of territory, including Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic states. But it brought what Russia needed most: peace. The fighting stopped, soldiers returned home, and a nation on the verge of collapse was given room to breathe. For ordinary Russians, especially the peasants and workers, this was not seen as a betrayal. It was a lifeline. Ending the war, no matter the cost, saved millions of lives that would otherwise have been lost on the front lines and in famine-ravaged cities. At the same time, Lenin tackled one of Russia's oldest curses, the land question. For centuries, Russian peasants had dreamed of owning the fields they worked, but the Tsarist aristocracy kept the land locked away under noble titles and church control. Lenin shattered that system overnight. The decree on land abolished aristocratic and church land ownership and redistributed land to the peasants. Suddenly, millions of families who had lived generation after generation as tenants or serfs found themselves owners of the soil they worked. This was not a token gesture. It was a profound social revolution. It fundamentally changed rural Russia and fulfilled promises that previous governments had been too weak or too scared to honor. As Lenin stabilized the countryside, he turned his attention to the urban workers who had fueled the revolution. Under Tsarist rule, factory workers labored 12 to 14 hours a day in brutal conditions without rights or representation. Lenin's government introduced a maximum 8-hour workday, one of the most progressive labor policies in the world at the time. Workers gained the right to form unions, elect factory committees, and have a say in the running of their workplaces. These were not just cosmetic reforms. They gave real political and economic power to classes that had been crushed under the industrial boot for decades. For millions of Russian workers, life under Lenin was not only different, it was better than anything they had experienced before. Education, too, underwent a revolution. In 1917, Russia was a country of widespread illiteracy, especially in rural areas where entire villages had never seen a schoolhouse. Lenin believed that political revolution was useless if people remained ignorant. His government launched an ambitious campaign to establish free, universal education for all children. Schools were opened across the country, even in the most remote villages. Adult literacy programs were launched, sending volunteer teachers deep into the countryside to teach reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. As a result, Russia's literacy rate began to climb sharply within just a few years. Lenin's drive to educate the masses laid the foundation for the Soviet Union's later achievements in science, industry, and military power. However, not everything went smoothly. The Russian Civil War devastated the economy. Factories stood idle, famine spread, and trade collapsed. Recognizing that pure communist policies could not rebuild the shattered nation, Lenin made a pragmatic shift in 1921 by introducing the new economic policy NEP. The NEP temporarily reintroduced small-scale private trade, allowed peasants to sell surplus food on open markets, and permitted small businesses to operate independently. While major industries and banking remained under state control, the new economic policy revitalized the economy almost immediately. Markets bustled, food became more available, and cities began to recover. Lenin showed that he was not a rigid ideologue, but a leader willing to adapt to save the revolution and the people who depended on it. In a few short years after 1917, Lenin did what no czar had ever done. He ended a catastrophic war, freed millions of peasants, gave dignity to the working class, opened the doors of education to the masses, and rescued Russia's economy from the brink of ruin. His methods were often ruthless, but the impact on everyday life for millions of Russians was undeniable. He had taken a broken, backward empire and, against unimaginable odds, had given it a new beginning. But some things are what people very often criticize. One such thing is the Cheka, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. It was led by Felix Dzerzhinsky, a hard man with no mercy. The Cheka had no rules. They could arrest anyone, interrogate anyone, execute anyone, with or without a trial. Their first victims were liberals from the Cadet Party, people who believed in elections and free speech. They were lined up and shot. Lenin didn't pretend it was a mistake. He supported it. Fear wasn't a side effect. It was policy. From that moment, Lenin wasn't a rebel anymore. He was the ruler of a new kind of state, one that smiled with promises and stabbed with silence. Russia hadn't voted for the Bolsheviks. It hadn't asked for a one-party system. But now it has one, and what came next would make even this coup look small. A civil war, a mass slaughter, and a level of fear the world had never seen before. By early 1918, Lenin was in full control of the government, but not of Russia. The Bolsheviks held Petrograd and Moscow, but much of the country was against them. Farmers didn't want to hand over their grain. Soldiers didn't want to fight anymore, and other political groups, Tsarists, liberals, socialists, and even some leftist rivals, began rising with weapons. What followed was the Russian Civil War, one of the bloodiest and most brutal wars in modern history. It was the Reds versus the Whites. The Reds were Lenin's Bolsheviks, defending their new rule. The Whites were a mix of royalists, generals, conservatives, and moderate revolutionaries trying to stop him. But Lenin wasn't just fighting armies. He was fighting an idea that the revolution could be reversed, and he was ready to do whatever it took to make sure it couldn't. In August 1918, something happened that pushed Lenin over the edge. A woman named Fanny Kaplan, a socialist who felt betrayed by Lenin, shot him twice in the shoulder and neck. He survived, barely. But his response was immediate. He ordered the start of mass executions, writing directly to local officials. Hang publicly. This wasn't just about killing enemies. This was about sending a message. From 1918 onward, the Cheka, Lenin's secret police, became a death machine. They arrested anyone suspected of disloyalty. Teachers, priests, shopkeepers, even children. They didn't need trials. They didn't need evidence. One of the darkest secrets of Lenin's civil war was what happened to the former royal family. After Tsar Nicholas II abdicated in 1917, he and his wife, Alexandra, along with their 5 children, were placed under house arrest. They were moved from one town to another as the war heated up. By July 1918, the Whites were getting close to the town of Ekaterinburg, where the family was being held. Lenin and his inner circle made a decision. The Tsar must die. And so must the rest of the family. Every last one, including the children. On the night of July 17th, the family was woken up and told to get dressed for a move. They were led into a basement and lined up for a photo for safety. Moments later, Cheka guards entered and opened fire. For years, the Soviet government lied. They claimed only the Tsar had been killed. The truth, that the entire family had been slaughtered, was kept secret until decades later. While the war raged, Lenin introduced a harsh new policy called war communism. It meant the government would take all the grain from the peasants by force. Factories would be nationalized. The black market would be crushed. All food would be controlled by the state, but it failed terribly. Peasants hid their grain. The army raided villages. In some places, people burned their crops rather than give them up. The country collapsed into chaos due to many other reasons as well. Foreign countries offered help. America's Red Cross sent ships of food and medicine, but Lenin was slow to accept it. At one point, he even said, "Let them perish. The revolution is worth it." To him, suffering was not a problem. It was a price. The Reds won the Civil War through fear, control, and absolute brutality. They out-organized the Whites. Trotsky created a Red Army with strict discipline, including executions for disobedience. The Bolsheviks took control of the railways, the factories, and the cities. The countryside was starved into submission. By 1922, most of their enemies had been crushed. Russia lay in ruins, but Lenin was now undisputed ruler of what would become the Soviet Union. But the victory came at a terrible cost. 1 to 2 million people were executed or murdered. 5 million died in famine, and millions more fled the country. And the worst part? It was only just beginning, because by now, Lenin's health was failing. He was only 52 years old, but already sick and shaking. Years of stress, sleepless nights, and non-stop arguments had broken his body. He had headaches, dizzy spells, and constant pain in his right arm. Then, in May 1922, the first stroke hit. He lost his ability to speak. His face drooped. His writing hand went numb. And for the first time in his life, Lenin was powerless, not politically, but physically. Still, he refused to give up. He struggled to write with his left hand. He dictated notes to his wife, Krupskaya, and personal aides. But one thing haunted his mind more than the pain: Stalin. While Lenin was battling illness, Joseph Stalin was making moves. Back in 1922, the party had given Stalin a new job, General Secretary of the Communist Party. It didn't sound impressive. It was just supposed to be administrative, keeping party files, assigning jobs, and making sure Lenin's ideas were followed. But Stalin understood power in a way most people didn't. He used his role to appoint loyal followers to key positions. He quietly built a network of people who owed him everything. And as Lenin grew weaker, Stalin grew stronger, without making a scene. At first, Lenin trusted him. But then something changed. Between late 1922 and early 1923, Lenin had more strokes. He could no longer walk properly. Speaking was difficult, but in moments of clarity, he dictated what would become his final political message, the Testament. In this short but explosive letter, Lenin warned the Communist Party that Stalin was dangerous. He wrote, "Stalin is too rude. This defect, although quite tolerable in our midst and dealings among us communists, becomes intolerable in the office of General Secretary." He even suggested removing Stalin from power. Lenin saw that Stalin had become arrogant, violent, and too hungry for control. And he feared that if Stalin stayed in charge, everything he had built would turn into dictatorship, not of the people, but of one man. But here's what happened. Stalin hid the letter. He made sure it wasn't read publicly at the party congress. Only a few leaders saw it, and none dared to challenge Stalin. The warning died with Lenin. In 1923, Lenin was living at his country estate in Gorky, just outside Moscow. He was surrounded by nurses, guards, and doctors. Krupskaya stayed by his side, but Stalin controlled access. He decided who could visit, what was published, and what Lenin could hear. There were rumors that Stalin insulted Krupskaya during an argument. Lenin was furious and tried to cut all ties with him, but it was too late. By January 1924, Lenin's body had given up. On the 21st, he died in his bed, paralyzed, speechless, and helpless. Official cause? Stroke. Unofficial theories? Slow poisoning, syphilis, arteriosclerosis, and even mercury exposure. To this day, nobody knows for sure. After Lenin's death, the Soviet government announced something strange. They would preserve his brain, study it, and discover the secrets of his genius. They called it the Lenin Institute. Led by German neurologist Oskar Vogt, the team sliced Lenin's brain into over 30,000 thin sections. They examined it under microscopes, looking for signs of intelligence, brilliance, anything special. Stalin saw an opportunity. He ordered Lenin's body to be embalmed, perfectly preserved, and placed in a glass tomb in Moscow's Red Square, a public display of eternal power. Millions came to see the body. Children were taught that Lenin loved birds, flowers, and babies. Songs, poems, and paintings portrayed him as kind and gentle, a grandfather of the people. So, Lenin built the system, Stalin inherited the machine, and now the Soviet Union belonged to someone who wouldn't just kill his enemies, he'd erase them from history. Stalin had already begun building his strength long before Lenin's final breath. He controlled the secretariat, the party's bureaucracy, and the flow of information. In a system where decisions were made behind closed doors, that meant everything. He did not grab power with a grand speech. He did not declare himself the new Lenin. Instead, Stalin acted slowly, silently. He began promoting men who owed him favors into important posts across the Soviet government. He marginalized his rivals, forcing them into meaningless positions where they had no influence. He decided who received resources, who got honors, and who simply faded into obscurity. He made sure that within just a few years, every key position was filled by someone who depended on him to survive. The old comrades who had fought beside Lenin, men like Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, believed Stalin could be controlled. They thought he was just a boring bureaucrat, a man of paper and forms, not ideas. They were wrong. Trotsky, who had been the hero of the Red Army, the man who many believed would naturally step into Lenin's shoes, quickly found himself isolated. Stalin outmaneuvered him in the party congresses, surrounded him with enemies, and poisoned his reputation by whispering lies into the ears of the newly rising generation. By 1925, Trotsky had been stripped of real power. By 1927, he was expelled from the party. By 1929, he was forced into exile, first to Turkey, then to Mexico, where he would spend his last days looking over his shoulder, knowing that Stalin's assassins were coming for him. As Stalin tightened his grip, he began to reshape the Soviet Union itself. Lenin had imagined a dictatorship of the proletariat, a temporary system where the working class would hold power before moving toward a stateless, classless society. Stalin had a different vision. He believed in the power of the state, not as a temporary measure, but as a permanent engine of control. Under his rule, the Soviet Union became a state where the party ruled absolutely and where questioning the leadership was treated as a crime against the people themselves. Factories rose out of the ground at a furious pace. Entire cities were built from nothing in the Ural Mountains and the Siberian plains. The country that had been mostly peasants and mud roads under the Tsars became a land of steel, oil, and electricity. Stalin launched massive plans to industrialize the Soviet economy, forcing it forward at any cost. The countryside was ripped apart as peasants were ordered to give up their land and join massive collective farms. Those who resisted, labeled kulaks, enemies of the people, were arrested, deported, or killed by the hundreds of thousands. Fear became a constant companion of Soviet life. The Cheka, Lenin's secret police, was transformed into the NKVD, bigger, deadlier, and more invasive. Neighbors spied on neighbors. Children were encouraged to denounce their parents. One wrong word could mean a knock at the door at midnight, a trial without defense, and a bullet in a basement no one ever saw again. The Great Purge of the 1930s swept away not only Stalin's enemies, but even his old comrades, the very men and women who had fought beside Lenin to bring the revolution to life. They were forced to confess to crimes they had never committed, paraded before the cameras, and executed as traitors to the cause they had given their lives to build. Yet, despite the blood, despite the fear, Stalin's Soviet Union became something the world could not ignore. When Nazi Germany unleashed its war machine across Europe, it was the Soviet Union, not Britain, not America, that bore the brunt of the assault. 20 million Soviets died fighting the Nazis. Entire cities were leveled. But when the smoke cleared, it was the red flag of the Soviet Union that flew over Berlin. It was the Soviet people, born from Lenin's revolution and hardened under Stalin's rule, who had defeated one of the greatest threats to human freedom the world had ever known. In the years that followed, the Soviet Union stood as a superpower, rivaled only by the United States. It controlled half of Europe. It launched the first satellite into space. It became the symbol of a different kind of world, one where capitalism was not the only answer, where the working man could, at least in theory, rise to greatness. And yet, the dream had changed. It was no longer the hopeful, chaotic dream of the Soviets in 1917. It was the iron-cold reality of a centralized, militarized, controlled empire. Whether Stalin had betrayed Lenin's vision or fulfilled it by taking it to its logical end remains a question historians still argue today. But what cannot be denied is that it was Lenin who built the foundation, and Stalin who turned it into the towering, terrifying fortress the Soviet Union became. The revolution had won, but in winning, it had become something else entirely. Many say that after the death of Lenin, the Soviet Union died. Is that so? For decades after Lenin's death, the Soviet Union stood as a giant in the world, a land of industry, steel, and endless parades, where red banners flew higher than church bells, and Lenin's name was whispered like a sacred spell. Stalin had turned it into a fortress, and even after Stalin himself died in 1953, the machine he built kept moving. Leaders changed. Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko. But the system stayed. The Soviet Union sent the first satellite into space. It sent the first man, Yuri Gagarin, beyond the skies. It faced down the United States in a Cold War that made the entire planet hold its breath for decades. From the outside, it looked invincible, a state that could survive anything: famine, war, political purges, international sanctions. But under the surface, the cracks were already spreading. The dream that had once lit fires in 1917, a world of justice, equality, and dignity for all, had slowly hardened into bureaucracy, corruption, and fear. The Soviets had beaten Hitler. They had built nuclear weapons, but ordinary people in the Soviet Union often found themselves trapped in tiny apartments, waiting in endless breadlines, censored from speaking their minds, and living under a government that demanded loyalty, but gave little in return. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet economy began to rot from the inside. The grand 5-year plans that once built steel mills now produced broken promises. Agriculture was inefficient, factories were outdated, shops were often empty. Innovation slowed. People laughed at bitter jokes about the system, but few dared to hope it could be changed. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in 1985, the Soviet Union was a giant with tired legs. Gorbachev saw the problems. He introduced new policies: glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring, hoping to revive Lenin's original spirit of renewal. He allowed more freedom of speech. He tried to reform the economy. He tried to make socialism smarter, kinder, and more flexible. But by then, it was too late. The truth was simple. Once people got a taste of freedom, they didn't want reforms. They wanted a life without fear. They wanted a voice that mattered. They wanted a future that was their own. In the republics that made up the Soviet Union, Ukraine, Lithuania, Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and so many others, nationalism and local pride boiled over. People didn't just want better communism. They wanted independence. They wanted their nations back. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, the great symbol of Soviet power in Europe, was torn down by ordinary people. Across Eastern Europe, Soviet-backed regimes fell like dominoes. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania. By 1991, even inside the Soviet Union itself, cracks turned into earthquakes. In August 1991, hardliners in Moscow staged a desperate coup to preserve the old system. Tanks rolled into the streets. For a few days, it looked like the ghosts of 1917 might return. But the people stood firm. Protesters built barricades. Soldiers refused orders. Boris Yeltsin, standing on a tank in front of the Russian White House, called for resistance. The coup collapsed. The Communist Party, the once unstoppable machine, fell apart almost overnight. On December 25, 1991, the hammer and sickle flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union, the empire built from Lenin's revolution, officially ceased to exist. The world watched in shock. 74 years after the October Revolution, it was over. No war, no invasion, no dramatic collapse from the outside. The Soviet Union crumbled from within, from exhaustion, from broken promises, from a people who had finally had enough. But was it the decline of the Russian Revolution? The fall of the Soviet Union was not the end of Lenin's revolution. It was its final echo. Because what had begun in the streets of Petrograd in 1917 was never just about creating a socialist state. It was about tearing down an old world, an empire of inequality, of blind obedience, of frozen traditions, and building something radically new in its place. And in that goal, the Russian Revolution had already succeeded long before the Soviet Union fell. The Romanov dynasty was gone forever. The system of kings, landlords, and priests ruling the poor was buried and could not return. The idea that the Russian people were passive subjects had been shattered permanently. Even after the Soviet Union collapsed, even after the party bureaucrats lost their power and the statues of Lenin were pulled down in some cities, Russia itself remained profoundly changed by the events of 1917. The fall of the USSR was not a return to the world before Lenin. It was the birth of something new. A Russia that still believed in its right to exist on its own terms, to chart its future without asking permission from kings, emperors, or foreign presidents. In 1917, the Russian Revolution said, "We will no longer be ruled by those who ignore our suffering." In 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union said something just as powerful. We will no longer be ruled by a system that has forgotten why it was created. It was not foreign armies that brought the Soviet Union to its knees. It was the children and grandchildren of the revolutionaries themselves, people who knew that the revolution had once been about freedom, dignity, and hope, and who could see that those promises had been broken by decades of fear, control, and stagnation. The Russian Revolution had been a call for justice. The Soviet collapse was a call for honesty. Strangely, the end of the Soviet Union fulfilled the spirit of 1917, not by preserving the Soviet system, but by reminding the world that no system, no matter how powerful, is above the people who live under it. The revolution had changed the map. The Soviet Union had changed the world. And their end changed what it meant to be Russian once again. When the Soviet Union fell, many believed the story of the Russian Revolution was over. They were wrong. The revolution did not die. It simply changed its face once again and marched into the future under a new name. So, was the dream over? That depends on how you look at it. The Soviet Union was gone, but Russia remained. And the spirit that had been born in the fires of 1917, the spirit of survival, strength, and sovereignty, did not die with the red flag. Russia entered the 1990s battered and broken. The economy collapsed. Crime exploded. Millions were thrown into poverty. For many Russians, it felt like humiliation, like everything that had been built, no matter the cost, was now being auctioned away to the highest bidder. It was a dark time, but Russia did not vanish. It did not disappear into the dustbin of history like so many had predicted. Instead, it adapted. It endured. The The dream of a workers' paradise may have fallen apart, but the idea of Russia as a strong, independent nation, refusing to be ruled by outsiders, determined to forge its path no matter the obstacles, has survived, and it is still very much alive today. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not the end of Russia's story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where the lessons, the sacrifices, and yes, the betrayals of the revolution would be carried forward into a new, uncertain world. Across every part of that story, we can say, when Vladimir Lenin's heart stopped beating in January 1924, the world did not simply lose a revolutionary. It lost a force that had altered the very direction of history. Lenin had risen from the quiet banks of the Volga River, from a grieving boy with a hanged brother, to the architect of the most daring political experiment the modern world had ever seen. He had taken a broken empire, shattered by war and injustice, and reshaped it into something new, something terrifying, something hopeful, something no one could ever ignore again. He did not live to see what his revolution would truly become. He did not live to see how his dream would be bent, twisted, and sharpened into weapons by those who came after him. But he left behind a foundation so deep that even today, a century later, its stones still hold up the walls of a country that refuses to fall. The Soviet Union that Lenin founded became one of the two global giants of the 20th century. It survived against enemies at home and abroad. It built massive industries out of nothing but frozen ground. It sent human beings into space before any other nation could even imagine it. It forged a pride so deep that even after decades of hardship, millions of people called themselves Soviet with real burning loyalty. It is easy to talk about the fear, the famines, the mistakes, and they were real. The Red Terror, the Civil War, the purges under Stalin, these are scars that cannot be erased. But if you only see the blood, you miss the bigger truth. Lenin created something that the world had never seen before, and may never see again. He gave millions of ordinary people a sense that they mattered. He gave the peasants who once bowed to landlords a voice. He gave the workers who once slaved for crumbs a reason to lift their heads high. Even when the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, after years of stagnation, political corruption, and economic decay, the spirit of Lenin's revolution did not die. It lived on in the memory of victory over fascism. It lived on in the stories told by grandparents to grandchildren about the days when they first learned to read, worked in factories built by their own hands, and first believed that they were part of something bigger than themselves. It lived on in the resilience of the Russian people. When the economy crumbled in the 1990s, when factories closed, when entire cities fell into poverty, many in the West thought Russia would break apart like other fallen empires, a patchwork of lost provinces and ghost cities, but Russia did not break. It suffered, it bled, but it survived because the Russian soul had already been forged in the fires of revolution and war, because the belief that Russia must control its destiny, that it must never again be ruled by outsiders, had already been written into the DNA of the people. That belief came from Lenin. Today's Russia, for all its changes, for all its new challenges, still carries that legacy. The commitment to sovereignty, the deep suspicion of foreign intervention, the pride in survival, in strength, in rebuilding, no matter how many times the ground collapses beneath their feet. You can see it in the streets of Moscow, where statues of Lenin still stand. Not because everyone agrees with him anymore, but because history itself cannot be erased. You can see it in the Russian government's fierce insistence on independence in world affairs. You can see it in the way Russian citizens, whether rich or poor, speak about their nation, not as something given to them, but as something earned through blood, labor, and sacrifice. The revolution Lenin launched changed the world far beyond Russia's borders too. It gave hope to anti-colonial movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It terrified empires that had ruled unchecked for centuries. It proved that no system, no king, no president, no billionaire is untouchable when ordinary people decide they have had enough. Of course, the ideal was never fully realized. Corruption seeped into the new state just as it had the old. Freedom, promised to the masses, was often restricted by fear. Equality, the dream shouted in the streets in 1917, turned into another kind of hierarchy, not of blood, but of party loyalty. And yet, through all of that, something survived. The Russian Revolution did not create a utopia. It created survivors. It created a people who could endure catastrophe, rebuild from ashes, and refuse to bow, even when the winds of history howled against them. That is Lenin's true legacy. Not the slogans, not the monuments, not the textbooks filled with red ink and golden promises. His legacy lives in the strength of a nation that has risen from defeat after defeat, in a people who, even when betrayed by leaders or battered by storms, still stand on their ground, with their voice in their name. Lenin did not just change Russia. He made it impossible for Russia to ever be conquered again. Not by kings, not by bankers, not by foreign armies, not even by the tides of history itself. Whatever you think of him, hero or villain, savior or destroyer, one fact remains beyond argument. Vladimir Lenin built a revolution that could not be undone. And Russia, in every breath it takes today, still carries the echoes of that revolution. What do you think of Lenin? Let us know in the comments section. Do you think he was a hero or not? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: African politics, economy, and increasing power. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.